Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay. So I'm very pleased to be here today. As she mentioned, I come from Los Angeles, and I look around the room and I see a lot of young students who look a lot like my children. I have 2 teenagers at home, both in high school, a daughter who is 17 and a son who is 14. So getting this trip to Spain is very special for me because I get a week to myself, which is very nice. So I wanted to, I'm going to talk mostly, in fact completely, about women in STEM, but my research really covers a lot of broad topics. I do look at, I focus primarily on gender differences in the college student population. How many of you here are college students among the students? You're mostly high school? Yeah, okay, high school students. So my research mostly focuses on gender differences when students enter college and what happens during college to either reinforce those differences or to make the gender gap smaller. And one of the most important areas of gender difference is STEM, and I don't even need to say more about that, but I will. But that is one of the most significant gender gaps that we have in the United States. And I was invited here to share some of the research that I have been doing on this topic. But I first want to tell you how I became interested in STEM. I am not an engineer or a computer scientist. I'm a social scientist, very different. And my interest in STEM began over 25 years ago when I was an undergraduate student, a new college student at Berkeley. And up until I got to Berkeley, I was very confident in math. I loved math, and my father always told me you should become an engineer, but he didn't tell me what that meant. And I don't know if it's the same here, but in the United States, if you say someone's an engineer, it could also be a train conductor, right? So I didn't understand why he wanted me to become a train conductor, so I wasn't interested in that. So no one ever explained to me what an engineer was. But when I came to college, I was still confident in math, and I really, wanted to pursue that. In my first math class at college, I was surrounded primarily by men. This was at Berkeley in 1986. And I felt very isolated in the class. I felt intimidated by the professor, and I did not know how to get involved in study groups that were being formed, the collaborative study groups that were being formed mostly by men. It was just very difficult. And what I found is that things that I cared more about, the issues of social inequity, were topics that I was finding in other disciplines, in sociology and history and economics, and political science. So I ended up moving away from math, but I always had this question, why did I get lost from math? And so when I came to graduate school in the 1990s, the very first question I asked was, what happens to women's math confidence when they get to college? And I found a very significant gender gap that became only larger as students went through higher education. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So this is, before I talk about STEM, I want to give you a little context of how women are represented in colleges in the United States. And it sounds very similar to what the numbers were here. So this chart shows from the 1960s up until 2011, the number of women and men entering colleges and universities in the United States. And one of the things that you can see from this slide is that the number of women, of course, it has grown over time. And I would say the media message in the United States is that women are an academic success story. Women earn better grades than men, women are better students than men, women go to college at greater rates than men. But the truth is that men also are increasing in their numbers in college. It's not as if men are not going to college, but the message that the media portrays is that men are in trouble. So the real issue is that there are certain groups of women who are more likely to go to college than men. And where we've seen these increases among women is in groups that are underrepresented. So low-income women, racial ethnic minority women, so in the US that would be African American and Latina women and Asian women. women who are the first in their families to attend college. These women are now more likely to go to college than ever before, but the men from these same groups tend not to, or are more likely to decide not to go to college. They want to get a job right away and make money. So that's mainly why you see this growing gender gap. So where we are today is that women are 57% of college students. In fact, today they're 58%, but in 2011 they were 57% of college students in the United States. And what did we say the number was in Spain? What proportion of college students are women? 61. So even more. Okay. So despite this, similar to what we have in Spain, and I don't know what this percentage looks like here, but, oh, see, I'm moving the wrong slide. Okay. The proportion of degrees earned in STEM fields is far lower for women than it is among all degrees. So on the left side, you see women are 57% of all college degrees that are earned, but on the right side, women are only 35% of the degrees earned in STEM fields. Now, this obviously shows their underrepresentation, but that doesn't really tell the whole story. And part of the problem is that when most of the discussion around STEM focuses on all STEM fields combined. It includes all different fields. I'll talk about that in a minute. So why are we concerned about women's underrepresentation in STEM? In the United States, I would say three primary reasons are women's economic independence. So for that, we know that careers in STEM, at least in the United States, women who earn degrees in STEM earn more money than women in other fields. So for their own economic independence, it's important for women to major in STEM. We also know that to be competitive on a global level, the United States, and I'm sure Spain, needs more trained people in STEM fields. And so when we don't have as many women going into the field, we're not tapping into an important source of knowledge, an important source of potential intellectual expertise when women are not represented. And then finally, there's the issue of diversity. We talk a lot about diversity in the United States, and one of the major, well, maybe not major, one of my major arguments for increasing the representation of women is that we need more diverse perspectives. When the voices of women are not heard in STEM, it affects the development of STEM products and research. So the more diversity you have by gender, by race, by class, the better your product or your output is going to be in STEM. So it matters that we have a gender gap. Now, there's a lot of explanations for why we have a gender gap in STEM, and they kind of go into two different categories. One has to do with experiences in education, and the other one has to do with experiences the students have outside the classroom. So when it comes to educational settings, we find that women begin to opt out of STEM courses at middle and high school, and I think that's probably true here as well. What we find is that at least in the United States, the students who take the most advanced math and science classes in high school, we call them AP classes, advanced placement. These are classes that you take in high school to get college credit. And I don't know if you have the same thing here. Do you have that? Advanced placement? No, not the same. So you take classes in high school, but it gets you out of taking certain classes in college. But we find that women are underrepresented in these very important AP classes, especially when it comes to calculus and physics and chemistry and computer science. Whoops. Okay, I have two different screens going here. Sorry. Okay. So one I can see with my eyes and the other one I can't see. So we also find in the United States that there is an often very unwelcoming climate for women in college STEM majors. So just like the experience I had, we find many women talk about feeling isolated in large lecture halls. The grading practices are often very competitive, grading on a curve. I don't know if that's a phrase you use here, but very competitive grading practices. And also that just the fact that there are so few women in certain STEM fields, that is a reinforcing problem, that the women don't see women who look like themselves in their major. So they think, okay, I'm not going to fit here. So it's very challenging for women to want to pursue a field where they are a gender minority, and a vast gender minority. Another important element is the teachers and the faculty, and what we find is that in STEM courses in the United States, we find more traditional teaching practices. So that means you're more likely to have a professor like this standing up and lecturing. This is not necessarily the best way to learn, right? When I teach my classes, I like to engage my students in lots of questions. But in STEM classes, you tend to find instructors who are focused on lecturing and not necessarily promoting collaborative work, group projects. Now, some of this is changing, which I can talk about, but in general, that has been the history, and that is part of the reason why women tend to not prefer many of the STEM courses, because the teaching practices are not conducive to how they prefer to learn. And also that women tend to be more intimidated by their professors than men. I wish this wasn't the case, but I've done lots of research on this, and women tend to be more likely than men to want to always please and to always show that they're smart. So they feel that if they approach their professors, they might reveal that they don't understand something, right? So then they're intimidated and they don't always go and talk to their faculty. So that's another very important problem. And also there's just a general lack of female role models in STEM. So there's very few women, relatively few women, who are teaching in the STEM fields in colleges and universities. So it's often difficult for women to perceive that they could have a career in that area. Now, there's also forces that exist beyond the classroom. And the first one I think is very important, a sense of belonging. Everybody wants to belong to their particular field and to feel comfortable there. But unfortunately, despite all of the progress that women have made in education, science careers are still perceived as very masculine, especially engineering and computer science. And this perception is reinforced by their friends, it's reinforced by their parents, and it's often reinforced by their teachers, and it's certainly reinforced by the media, especially movies and television. So if you think about the kind of scientists we often see in movies and television, quite often they're men, especially engineers. Another factor that matters for women is that science careers are perceived as competitive and unwelcoming and difficult to find a balance between work and family. And that may be true, that these careers can be very competitive and time-consuming, but so are a lot of other careers that women do pursue. So fields like law and medicine, now in the United States, women are more likely than men to pursue law and medicine, but those careers are very demanding and time-consuming, and it is difficult to balance family and work. So STEM fields still have this perception that is sort of difficult to break. And then the third here, this says societal benefits matter, but they're not clearly understood. So what that means is that women tend to care about pursuing a career where they can make a difference in the world, right? This is not my opinion. This comes from national surveys of college students, and we ask them why do they want to pursue a certain career. The women are more likely than the men to say, I want to make a difference in the world. I want to make the world a better place. I want to help people. I want to improve society. Like, these are the kinds of things that women tend to say more than men. The men, on the other hand, they tend to value making money as a reason for their career. So the problem is that STEM fields are not taught in a way that helps students really understand how the work of STEM can contribute to improving society. We know that it does, right? We look at all the technology around us, and we know that so much of it is designed in healthcare and other fields to benefit society, but that's not how women are introduced to the topic. So they tend to think, no, it's not really, it's not a field I'm going to pursue to make a difference. In addition to all that is the issue of self-confidence. So we conduct national surveys at UCLA, surveys of hundreds of thousands of students at hundreds of colleges around the country every year, and we ask them to tell us about their levels of confidence. So they are asked to say so we give them a 5-point scale. They can say they're compared to the average person their age, they're the highest 10%. So I want you to think, you students, how you would answer this. So if I said to you, rate yourself compared to the average person your age on math ability and computer ability. And think about where you'd place yourself. Would you say that you're in the highest 10% compared to all other people your age, above average, average, below average, or lowest 10%? And what we find is that the men are significantly more likely than the women to say that they are highest 10% and above average. So if you look at those numbers there, 47% of men and only 30% of women rate themselves highly in their computer skills. When it comes to math, also almost 56% of men and only 36% of women rate themselves highly in their mathematical abilities. Now you might say, well, this is just a function of the kinds of test scores they get. But actually what I've done is I've taken the students' test scores and I've found that when men score in the top 10% on the standardized test scores in math, they are typically likely to say, yeah, I'm in the top 10%. If a woman scores in the top 10%, she's more likely to say she's just above average. So she's not willing to say that she's in the top 10%. And this matters primarily because confidence is one of the strongest predictors of pursuing a career in STEM. So it's very important. So this gender gap is very significant. This isn't a new gender gap. So this shows that gender gap in math ability over the past 40 years. And I have to say, I'm surprised that this gap is as enduring as it is. That for 40 years, there has been an unwavering gender difference in students' self-perception of their mathematical abilities, despite all of the progress women have made in education. To me, this is one of the biggest problems that we have to overcome, is dealing with self-confidence. So when I'm done with my presentation, I would love to hear more of your thoughts on how we can solve this problem, because clearly all the efforts that have been made have not solved this problem. Now, when it comes to the representation of women in different STEM fields, I want to show you how it looks over time. So if you look back, I have data from 1976 to 2011, and here we see in red, it's the proportion of all women in college who major in STEM fields, and blue is the proportion of men. So you can see that across all of these different time periods, men are significantly, oh, sorry, I advanced my, just let me know when I'm not, oh, I didn't show, you need to tell me that I'm on the right, I'm going to close my book. This was the math slide. You need to tell me that I'm not on the right slide. Okay, this was that enduring gender gap that I mentioned. So I want you to see this because it's very important. 40 years of a self-confidence gap. Okay, so what you're looking at here is the proportion of women in red and men in blue who plan to major in STEM over time. And clearly, across all of these different years, women are much less likely than men to major in STEM. When you look at the size of the gender gap, it kind of looks like it's about the same over time. It's hard to compare, just if you want to know the difference between the two. So the next slide just takes the difference and plots that out. And what you can see is that women had actually, well, the gender gap had narrowed for many years between 1976 and 2006. But by 2011, the gender gap is actually larger again. So I'm going to show you some slides about why this is the case. So the only way to really describe why this is the case is to look at the STEM fields separately. So most of the research that talks about gender gaps in STEM, it combines all these STEM fields together as if they're all one field, which of course we know they're not. How many of you plan to major in STEM fields, by the way? No? Okay. I want to work on you. So the research that is done on STEM tends to combine all of these fields together, but it's really important to look at them separately. So if you look here, this shows you the proportion of different STEM majors who are women. Across all the way on the left, you see that women are the most underrepresented in engineering, only 17%, and I don't know what that is in Spain. I don't know if anyone knows off the top, but women are 17% of engineering students in the United States, Okay, so you're doing better than we are, so that's good. And only 18% of computer science majors. But if you look all the way across at mathematics, women are about 43%, but in the biological sciences, women are at 58%. So, and here it's 50? Yeah. Oh, okay. So 58% of the biology majors in the United States are women. Why is that? Well, these are women who are planning to become doctors. For the most part, the students who major in biology are going to become doctors. So this explains why we have so many women in medicine. Medicine is perceived to be a helping field, so it makes sense that you have more women represented there. So the real problem that I see is occurring on the left side with engineering and computer science. So when you just talk about STEM fields together in the aggregate, combining them, it doesn't really tell the story. So then what I wanted to look at was how has this changed over time? So if you look over the past 40 years, I'm going to show you each of those 5 STEM fields. So the proportion of students majoring in the biological sciences used to be higher among the men if you go back into the 1970s. And then we saw a reversal to the point where now women are more represented. So this would be an example of a STEM field that's actually experienced a reversal of the gender gap. In math and statistics, there's a very, very, very small gender gap because there are very, very, very few students who plan to major in math and statistics. So, you know, there's the gender gap there is not really the focus of a lot of attention, but I think the bigger issue is that we don't have enough students majoring in this, and this leads to the shortage of teachers who are trained to teach mathematics and statistics in high schools. And that's a big problem in the United States. I don't know if it's the same problem here, but definitely a shortage. In the physical sciences, a small gender gap that has existed over time, but again, these are not one of the more popular fields. But where you see a very enduring gender gap over 40 years is in engineering. So if you look at this chart, you can see that over the last 40 years, there has been very little change in the size of the gender gap, with men consistently more likely. We're now at the point that over 20% of men in college plan to major in engineering, compared to only about 4% of women. We've seen some increases in the past few years, but really not enough to close the gender gap. And then finally, this is the area where I'm going to focus a little more of my talk, is computer science. So you can see here that over time, there's been a really interesting fluctuation of interest in majoring in computer science. In the early 1970s, there really was no such field as computer science, right? But when personal computers came about in the 1970s, students saw that as a career where they could have a lot of opportunity for jobs. And so both men and women, as you can see, both men and women were interested in computer science at that time. Ultimately, there weren't as many jobs as they would have hoped. And so we have a decline into the 1980s. Well, what happened in the 1990s? What happened then? We have the internet, right? So at the time that the internet came about, we had what we call the dot-com boom. And at that time, look who became interested in computer science. It was the men. The men chose computer science increasingly in the late 1990s because they saw economic opportunity with dot-com businesses. Women at that time really weren't attracted to computer science, right? They weren't interested. Now, one of the reasons for that is that since computer science became known as a field in the 1970s, the media started to portray the field computer scientists as very stereotypical, nerdy men, right, with glasses, sitting over a computer, and having no life, right? So that wasn't an image that the women wanted for themselves. So that stereotype really served to discourage many women from majoring in computer science. Today, in the United States, we're just starting to see an increase. Now, my data here only go to 2011. I can tell you the last 3 years, the numbers of women and men interested in computers has gone up, but much faster for the men. So what that means is the gender gap is actually getting larger, even when we have more women interested in computer science. Now, why focus on computer science? Why is that such an important area of study? So one of the reasons is that there is such an increasing global demand for people who are trained in computer science. It's not just people who are learning how to computer program. These are people who are developing apps that are useful in all fields, right? In the healthcare industry. And in Los Angeles, what's very popular? Movies, right? So filmmaking and music. People need individuals who are trained in technology to be able to develop all of the technology that's needed to work in these fields and to improve these fields. So the global demand is there. The second reason is that computer careers tend to be among the fastest growing and highest paying occupations in the United States. So if students want to make money in the US, they really ought to major in computer science if they have any interest in any mathematical and logical sort of interest. We have seen the number of colleges offering computer science has grown in the past 40 years from only 123 up to 600 colleges. And now it's even growing since then. So it's becoming much more popular, but again, it's still only attracting 18% of 18% of the students it attracts are women. So still, it's not attracting everybody equally. And then another reason to focus on computer science is women are underrepresented in jobs. They're only about 20% of the software developers, and one of the problems is that if only men are designing software, then you don't have the perspectives of women, you don't even have the voices of women, literally not the voices. So voice recognition software, when it was first developed, did not recognize women's voices because it was developed and tested only by men. So if you don't have women there to develop the technology, their needs will not be reflected. So how can the research help? So one of the important points that I want to make is that in order to attract more women to computer science, that's the goal, we need to better understand who they are. Are women in computer science different from men in computer science? Oh, you're not telling me. You got to tell me. Okay, one more. Oh, no, I'm on that one. Okay, yes. So how do they differ from women in other STEM majors? And how have they changed over the past 40 years? So the study that I'm conducting right now is funded by the National Science Foundation, which is part of the US federal government. And we are using data from a nationwide survey of college students that's been conducted for over 40 years. We're focusing on these 5 different STEM fields that I talked about: biology, computer science, engineering, math, and physical science. And we're looking at how they've changed over 40 years. So just for today, I'm going to give you a little bit about what I've learned about women in computer science. Who are the women pursuing these fields? So if I ask you, I'm going to try this one more time. Does anybody in the room plan to pursue computer science? Maybe. Maybe. Okay, yay, and I see a woman. That's good. Okay, so this is for you. Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to understand what kinds of women are interested in this field. What we find in the United States, oh, I'm doing it again, is that, so what I'm doing here for all of these slides, I'm comparing women in computer science, which is the blue line, with women in the rest of STEM. So how does computer science differ from other fields? And what we find is that women in computer science have always tended to come from lower income families than women in other STEM fields. That's actually changed over time. You can see the more recent years, it's starting to even out. This is the racial ethnic distribution. This has changed dramatically over time. So the green line on top is the proportion of college students in computer science, among women college students in computer science, who are white. So you can see the diversity of American higher education has really grown over the years. So computer science women used to be about 85% Caucasian or white, and now is about 45%. What we've seen in the early years, the purple line, was an increase in African American women. There were very successful efforts to recruit African American or black women into computer science in the 1980s, And those efforts have not really been successful lately, right? So now what we have is more Asian students, but fewer black students and fewer white students. So it's a little complicated of a picture, but I will say that computer science women are still more racially and ethnically diverse than computer science men. So there's a little more diversity there. This is something that's a very important issue in the United States. I know the diversity issues are quite different here. When it comes to achievement, so my question here is, what kinds of women pursue computer science? Are they the smartest women? Are they the most academically successful? And what I find is actually that women in computer science tend to have some of the lowest grades, which is really, it was surprising to me. So here I show you for all the different fields, you see for computer science, women have better grades than men. So the women are in red and the men are in blue. Women have better grades than men, but they all score lower than their friends and counterparts who are pursuing other STEM majors. So why is that? It's an interesting question. This has kind of always been the case. They've always attracted women with lower grades. What about their standardized test scores? In the United States, our college entrance exam is one of them is the SAT. You may have heard of that. It's the Scholastic Aptitude Test. And women in computer science score are just around the middle range compared to women in other STEM fields, and not as high as women in engineering and math. And this has mostly been the case, although the gap today is closing. Now, we also find that the SAT verbal scores, so this is just the more of the English reading and writing side, the women in computer science score the lowest of all of the STEM fields. So that's an important question. Why is it that computer science is not attracting the most talented students? So that's the trend over time. What about self-confidence? Are the women who pursue computers really very confident? And what we find, again, that women in computer science are among the least confident compared to women in other STEM fields. Right? So they are less likely to rate themselves as being in the highest 10% on their academic abilities. They rate themselves the lowest on their intellectual self-confidence. They rate themselves the lowest on their leadership ability. And they rate themselves the lowest on the drive to achieve. So you might want to know, what is it about computer science that tends to attract the women who tend to have lower levels of academic performance and lower levels of academic confidence? Right? I think that's a troubling issue. The next category that I looked at was their physical and emotional well-being. So what's going on in their heads? And what I find is that the women who major in computer science, they tend to score lower than women in all other STEM fields and all other fields on their ratings of their emotional well-being. Right? So they're more likely to say that they're not that emotionally healthy, that they're stressed and overwhelmed and depressed. These kinds of things are more common among women in women in computer science than women in other fields. That's a problem. In the United States, all of the women are declining in their emotional health, right? So they are increasingly feeling stressed, and they rate themselves lower and lower each year on their emotional well-being. The women in computer science also rate themselves the lowest on their physical well-being. So we ask them about their physical health, and they don't feel very confident. One of the reasons for that, and here you can see it's only gotten worse over time, and one of the reasons for that is that they spend the least amount of time on exercise. So the women in computer science, they're not exercising very much. They're feeling stressed. And this has been an increasing problem. What are they doing? Well, they're definitely spending more time playing video games and working on the computer, so that, it's not surprising. But one of the things that we know from research on college students, if I want to go back to the exercise, we actually find women in computer science exercise less than other women, and all women exercise less than men. This is a real problem. In my research, I have shown that the more time that women spend, and I want the women here to really listen to this, the more time that women spend on sports and exercise, not only are they better off psychologically and physically, but they get better grades. That actually doesn't happen for the men. The men who spend too much time on sports and exercise, their grades are lower. But for the women, it actually helps them to sort of de-stress, to have stress relief. It's very important. So I encourage all the women, get more exercise. Now, another area where women are different in computer science is in their orientation to community. We find that women in computer science are the least likely of all women to say that they want to be a leader in their communities. They're the least likely, other than math, to say that they want to help clean up the environment. And the least likely to say that they plan to participate in community service or volunteer work when they're in college. Now, this is problematic because the women in computer science, if we want women to want to change the world, to enter these fields, this is not the result that we're seeing. We're getting the women who care the least about improving the world, so that needs to change. And finally, artistic orientation. Are they more or less artistic? So this is where I have some of the more surprising findings. The whole time I've been showing you these slides, the women in computer science have been way on the left with the lowest scores. When it comes to their creative abilities, they rate themselves the highest compared to all women, especially in artistic ability. So what's happening is that if you look at the trend over time, you see that women entering computer science are increasingly seeing themselves as artistic and creative. This is a difference. We do not see this trend for men. So in other words, computer science is now starting to attract more creative women. It's not happening for the men. So if departments want to bring in more women, they need to emphasize the creativity and artistic application of computer science. So basically, I leave you with some questions, which is why you think that computer science tends to attract women who rate themselves lower on academic ability and on confidence, lower on their drive to achieve, lower on emotional health, lower on physical health, and lower on community orientation, and yet does attract women who are more creative and artistic. And I'm curious whether the faculty here see any of these kinds of trends among their own students. So to sort of sum up the presentation here, there is a pervasive gender gap in STEM, but you have to look at it separately across different STEM fields. And that the gender gap favors women in biology, but men in every other STEM field. And that when we think about what it's going to take to bring more women into fields like computer science, we need to understand their characteristics. Who are they? How can we attract them? So that's the nature of the research that I'm doing. I'm involved in a new project right now, which is funded by corporations. It's funded by Facebook and Google and Microsoft and Intel. And they are giving money to colleges that are committing themselves to increasing the number of women. And so my job is to study this for the next 3 years to see if it actually makes a difference. So that's my conclusion at this point. I am going to say first thank you and gracias, and also to see if you have any questions. So, yeah, thank you. No, sabe, ja.
Algú vol preguntar-li alguna cosa sobre el treball de recerca que he fet, sisplau? Sí. Jo penso que et sentiré bé. Endavant.
There are some research that points out that women have a lower self-confidence than men in computer abilities and math abilities. How can change these trends? Should we change the way of teaching? What's your opinion about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So right now, the question is how can we change what we're doing to bring in more women and make them feel more confident and interested? So the kinds of things that are happening right now in the United States and I mentioned the corporations, Google and the rest that are funding this program, they are providing money to schools who do any of these 4 things to bring more women into computer science. The first is to simply change the introductory computer science classes. So for example, at UC Berkeley, they have a very a large introductory class in computer science. And it was always called Introduction to Computer Science or Introduction to Computer Programming. Now they've changed the name to The Beauty and Joy of Computing. And now the enrollment of women has grown. They didn't just change the name. The name helped to get them in the door. But then they changed how they taught the class. They taught it using Python, which is a more interactive form of programming than Java. So they changed the way they taught it. And they're encouraging encouraging instructors to have more collaborative groups, not just independent work in computer science. That's one. A second is in colleges, it's important to offer more interdisciplinary courses, so not just computer programming, but computer programming and design, or computer programming and health, or computer programming and music, right? So if you can connect it with other areas. A third is to develop a sense of community for the women in computing, so for majors that have even just a few women, to have a club for them, right? And to have them get exposed to mentors and role models of women who are in computer science. And the fourth strategy is to do a lot of outreach to high schools, to find students like you, tell them about computer science, and get them to become interested, maybe through a summer camp or a summer class or an internship. So these are the kinds of things that are being explored right now, and I hope that they're effective, and I will find out. Yeah. Okay.
About the salary, in a company, there are more male directives than female. So the salary used to be higher in the male gender. Do the male gender do better those type of jobs than the female gender do?
Can you help me? I'm sorry. Oh, you're... Yeah, I mean, this is a very large cultural problem that we have not been able to solve. And it's true that in all fields, men continue to make more than women. I think women make like 77 cents for every dollar that men make. And this is true in every field. It is continuously a problem. It's still men dominate the power structures in the United States and perhaps here in Spain as well. But yeah, and one of, there's a lot of reasons for that. Some of that is discrimination, and some of that is that women need to be trained early on to ask for more money. Women need to be trained when they're hired to say, what did my predecessor make? What did the man make in my position? They need to advocate for themselves as well. But it's not just up to the women, it's up to the men too, to be educated about this so that they don't make the mistake of enforcing or applying gender discrimination. Right, and so that's partly what happens is that for many women who go off the career track to have families, when they come back in, they don't make as much money. But even the women who stay in just along with the men, they still continue to make less than the men. Yeah.
Thank you for the floor. At our school, there's a teacher that has created a book, a math book, on her own, and it's the one we're using at the moment in math class. Do you think that if a book is created by a woman, and, for example, students which are women use it, do you think it helps us connect more with the topic of math, for example?
Well,
thank you.
It's a very good question. I don't think there's an easy answer, right? Because plenty of men can create a math book that is going to be appealing to women, and plenty of women would create math books that are unappealing to women. But in general, regardless of who's developing the book, the important thing is in that book to provide examples that are relevant and interesting to all kinds of students. So if in a math book there's only an emphasis on examples from, let's say, sports and politics, and not from, healthcare and friendships or something else, then you're going to appeal more to the men. So the important thing is to think, what do all individuals care about, and how can we make sure that we give examples that are relevant and interesting to everybody? So, yeah.
Good afternoon. Before your lecture, you was told that we were the future. So, what do you think that we, as a future, could do for that gap?
Well,
thanks.
A couple of things. It's a big question. I think that, one of the things that's important is simply understanding, having an awareness of these gaps. I've spoken to students in the United States who are engineering majors, and I've told them about these gaps, and I still hear a lot of the men say, well, of course there's a gender gap. Why would any company want to hire a woman in engineering? She's just going to quit and have a baby. So the stereotypes are still there. So part of the answer is simply educating people about these inequities. I think that's one. And then when you're in a position to employ people, to make sure that you're looking out to recruit women, in part because having, like I said before, having a more diverse work group is important in improving the field. So I think certainly the first step is this kind of awareness. Yeah. Yeah, muchas gracias.